Animals hunting other animals for food is not a unique form of predation. Plants can also be prey, and when they are, the consumption of plants by animals is known as herbivory. Some plants have adaptations to defend against herbivory since they cannot run away from their predators. They also cannot utilize camouflage or mimicry to hide from the animals that eat them. Many of them have other defense mechanisms that defend them against herbivory. Some of these defense mechanisms include toxins known as secondary compounds that make plants unpalatable or toxic to animals that consume them. So a good example of a plant that contains a secondary compound is the foxglove. Notice it's this beautiful purpley pink plant, but the foxglove has this toxin in it that when consumed causes nausea, vomiting, convulsions, and can lead to death. Another example of a defense mechanism that plants employ is mechanical defenses such as thorns. Yet other plant species engage in mutualistic relationships with their predatory species that allows their seeds to be dispersed. Then there are symbiotic relationships. Symbiotic relationships are relationships between two organisms, whether they are both benefited, only one is benefited, and one is harmed, neither is benefited, or one is benefited and the other one is unaffected. Such relationships include mutualism, where two organisms live together and the relationship benefits both organisms. Pollination of flowers by insects or birds is the best example. Amensalism, where two organisms live together and one is harmed while the other one is unaffected by the presence of the other. And what you're seeing here is cattle producing a cattle path. They are sharing the same environment with the grass, but they're trampling the grass. And notice that the trampling of the grass by the cattle is leaving that path, which is harmful to the grass because it can't grow there. Then there's parasitism. In parasitism, two organisms live together and one is harmed while the other is benefited. Notice here the caterpillar is being consumed by maggots of a wasp larvae. And finally, there's commensalism, where two organisms live together and one is benefited but the other one is unaffected by the presence of the other. And notice what you see here is the nest of a bird in the crook of the branches of a tree, which is not affecting the tree at all, but it's benefiting the birds in that they have a place for their shelter. One of the relationships that can exist between organisms is competition, but competition is not beneficial to either of the organisms involved in the relationship. It can lead to something called competitive exclusion. Competitive exclusion occurs when two species occupy the same habitat. The two species are competing for the same resources but cannot exist together in the same niche. One species will outcompete the other and be more efficient at using and exploiting resources than the other one. Here you see a classic example of competitive exclusion between two species of Paramecium, P. aurelia and P. caudatum. Note that when the two species live apart, they both thrive individually. However, when they're living together, P. aurelia has a higher growth rate than P. caudatum. This is likely due to P. aurelia being better able to utilize available food sources than P. caudatum. Because P. aurelia can get adequate food supplies, its population can grow and thrive in the presence of P. caudatum, but P. caudatum suffers. Competitive exclusion can force species into resource partitioning, the idea that if a species cannot utilize a certain resource, it will use another available resource. Here's a table that summarizes the ecological relationships that I discussed in this lesson. Notice that mutualism benefits both organisms. Commensalism only benefits one organism, but the other organism is unaffected. Parasitism benefits one, but harms the other. Amensalism doesn't affect one organism, but harms the other. And in competition, both organisms are harmed.
In this lesson, you should have learned about symbiotic relationships that members of populations engage in with one another. Remember that those relationships can be helpful to both, harmful to both, or helpful to one and not the other. Now let's turn our attention to the biodiversity that exists in communities and how this biodiversity enables communities to survive in changing ecosystems. If you're ready to learn about biodiversity in communities, let's get started.